All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling some really cool stuff you've brought to the table, uh, exploring the origins of Bitcoin, basically. We're going to go deep into the ideas behind it, like way before Satoshi Nakamoto and that whole 2008 paper thing. Think of it as, think of it as like a fast track to understanding, where Bitcoin really came from.
Yeah, exactly. The sources you've gathered are fantastic, by the way. And what we'll try to do is bring it all together. Show the big innovations, highlight the people who really wrestled with this whole digital cash problem way before Bitcoin even existed, you know? We want to figure out what worked, what totally flopped, and how it all, paved the way for what we have now.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Back to the late 80s, early 90s, we have David Chaum and something called DigiCash. What was the big idea there?
Well, the interesting thing about Chaum is that he was like this cryptography whiz. Really early on, he saw the potential of digital transactions, and he knew privacy was going to be a huge deal. So DigiCash was a pretty big early attempt at making, anonymous digital currency.
And the tech behind that anonymity was something called blind signatures, right? How did that even work?
Oh, right. Yeah. Blind signatures, that was the big breakthrough. Imagine you're taking out digital cash from your bank, right? With this cryptography method, the bank could sign a digital coin, making it legit, but they couldn't trace that specific coin back to your account. It was like magic. And then when you spent that coin, the merchant could check the bank's signature, but wouldn't know it was you. The bank on their end was keeping track of the total amount of digital currency out there to prevent, someone making copies, but they didn't know who spent what. So yeah, the big takeaway from DigiCash is that, really strong cryptography, it could actually make digital transactions private.
So it was anonymous for users, but DigiCash still needed a central player, the bank, to issue and track everything. Looking back, it seems pretty different from Bitcoin's whole decentralized thing.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, needing a central bank, that was a big difference. It was super innovative for the time, technically speaking, but it didn't really fit with the whole, cypherpunk idea, which was all about cutting out the middleman and putting your trust in the code, not institutions. So even though it was promising, DigiCash struggled to, get people using it and eventually shut down in 98. I think the big lesson there for digital currency was that even amazing cryptography couldn't overcome the problems that come with centralized control, which, by the way, is something Satoshi totally understood later on.
Right. So DigiCash showed that cryptography could work for digital money, but that central control thing, that was a roadblock. Now let's move on to 98 again, this time to Wei Dai and his idea for B-money. This sounds more like a direct ancestor to Bitcoin's decentralized structure.
Absolutely. Dai was a computer engineer really into the whole cypherpunk movement. Those were the folks who wanted to use cryptography to give people privacy and freedom from, big institutions. So B-Money, which he talked about on a cypherpunk mailing list, was basically a framework for a digital currency that was both anonymous and decentralized. What's really cool is that Dai had two versions in mind. One still used a trusted server, but the other described a system where a whole network of people would keep a shared record of every transaction.
A shared record, like a ledger, kept by everyone.
Ah,
That sounds familiar. And the sources mention something about computational work in this decentralized B-money, right?
exactly. Dai's idea for the decentralized version was that everyone would have their own copy of the transaction database. And to make new money, people would have to do these super hard computational tasks, kind of like Bitcoin's proof of work mining, right? The whole point was to create a system where everyone working together, with everyone's incentives aligned, would keep the currency honest and stop people from cheating, like creating money out of thin air. So this whole concept of a distributed ledger maintained by, people's computers doing work, that's a huge contribution that directly led to Bitcoin.
Okay, so B-money had these ideas of a distributed ledger and something similar to mining. But synchronizing a whole network and, solving disputes without a central authority, that must have been a nightmare. Why didn't B-money become more than just an idea?
That's the key question. It stayed mostly theoretical. Dai never actually built a working version. I mean, imagine trying to keep all these decentralized computers in sync and resolving disagreements without anyone in charge, right? It was really tough, technically speaking. And Dai's proposal didn't really solve all those problems.
But the influence on Bitcoin is obvious. Satoshi even mentioned B-money in the Bitcoin paper.
Oh, totally. Satoshi gave B-Money credit for laying the groundwork. The ideas of a distributed ledger and using computational work to make money, that was all inspired by Dai. There's even some evidence that Satoshi and Wei Dai, actually talked before Bitcoin launched. So in a way, Dai laid out the vision of a decentralized system with this computational work thing, and Bitcoin actually made it real.
It's fascinating to see how these ideas connect. Okay, next up we have Nick Szabo and BitGold, which came around the same time as B-Money from 98 into the early 2000s. People say BitGold is the closest we get to an intellectual ancestor of Bitcoin. What made it so important?
Bitgold is really important because Szabo, who was a cryptographer and a legal theorist too, he was really aiming for a digital currency that was totally independent, no central authority at all. His big innovation was really laying out this idea of proof of work as a way to create, digital scarcity and value. He even called the units bits, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, Bitgold, it showed how powerful proof of work could be for creating digital scarcity, but it also showed how hard it was to actually achieve true decentralization and make it work on a big scale.
So BitGold wasn't just an idea, it was more fleshed out. How did this proof of work thing actually work in practice?
Okay, so with Bitgold, people would solve these super hard cryptographic puzzles. The solutions, which were unique strings of bits, would then get a timestamp and be recorded in a public registry, kind of like an early blockchain. Think of it as a record that everyone could see, only adding new entries, never changing old ones, and it tracked who owned those bits. And to transfer ownership, you'd use digital signatures, so only the rightful owner could spend them. The idea was that since it took a lot of computing power to make new bits, it would stop people from making copies and spending the same ones twice. Szabo even thought about using a market-based system to, keep Bitgold's value stable.
A public record secured by proof of work. It's really similar to Bitcoin. Why didn't BitGold catch on? What were the problems?
Well, kind of like B-Money, it never got fully built. Szabo himself admitted it was really tough to make it work. Scalability, like handling more and more transactions as it grew, that was a big worry. And then keeping all the computers in the network in sync without anyone in charge, that was still a huge problem. Plus, there was this thing called a Sybil attack, where one bad actor could create a bunch of fake identities and take control of the network, and that wasn't solved either.
So it sounds like the pieces were there, but building a decentralized system that was, strong, could grow, and was secure, that was still a big challenge. But it must have a big influence on Bitcoin.
It totally did. Bitgold's core ideas, things like proof of work, a public ledger everyone could check, and this dedication to being decentralized, all of that really shaped how Bitcoin works. It's so similar that some people actually thought Nick Szabo might be Satoshi Nakamoto, which he's always denied. But yeah, Bitcoin took the best parts of Bitgold and made them better, Like it introduced a way for everyone to agree on the rules, and it set a limit on how many Bitcoins could exist.
It's like everyone was finding pieces of the puzzle. Okay, let's back up a little bit to 1997 and Adam Back's Hashcash. This wasn't even supposed to be digital money, right?
Nope, not at all. Adam Back, who's a British cryptographer, he created Hashcash to fight email spam. The idea was to make sending tons of emails really expensive for computers, to discourage spammers.
So how did an anti-spam tool become so important for Bitcoin?
Well, the really clever thing about Hashcash was its proof of work system. To send an email, your computer had to do a bunch of work to make a special stamp. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, but with numbers. For regular people, it took like no time at all, but for spammers sending millions of emails, it became way too hard. The person receiving the email could quickly check if the work had been done. So the big idea was that proof of work could be used to make certain things online, cost something to do.
It's smart. You make something so expensive to do, it's not worth it anymore. But you said it wasn't meant to be money, right? There was no way to transfer value or track who owned what, like a ledger.
Exactly. Hashcash was for one specific thing. But the cool thing is, using proof of work to make something online cost something, that became super important for Bitcoin.
And we see that influence in how Bitcoin mining works.
You got it.
Yeah.
Satoshi took Hashcash's proof of work and made it the core of Bitcoin mining. It does two things. One, it makes the blockchain secure because it's too hard for someone to mess with past transactions. And two, it encourages people, the miners, to participate by giving them new Bitcoins as a reward. Satoshi even mentioned Adam Back's work in the Bitcoin paper, so he knew how important it was.
Wow. It's amazing how these seemingly random projects and ideas all came together. We've talked about the individual contributions, but there was also like a bigger picture thing happening in the 90s and early 2000s, right?
Yeah.
Like society and technology were changing in a way that made people really start thinking about digital currency.
Totally. You can't understand these early projects without talking about the cypherpunks. They were this group of tech people, cryptography experts, and activists who were like really worried about privacy, freedom, and the potential for big institutions to control the internet. They saw cryptography as a way to give power back to individuals.
And the internet was exploding, e-commerce was taking off. I bet that created a huge need for better ways to pay online.
Oh, for sure. The dot-com boom in the 90s showed how clunky the existing financial system was for online transactions. As more and more things moved online, it became clear we needed a way to pay for things digitally that was smooth and secure.
And then DigiCash, even though it was cool technology, it failed, right? I bet that made the cypherpunks even more convinced that a truly trustworthy digital currency had to be decentralized.
Exactly. DigiCash's problems, even with all its fancy tech, probably made them think, you know what? True digital freedom and security means getting rid of the middleman completely. So by the early 2000s, as we've seen, all the building blocks were their cryptographic signatures for security, proof of work to make things cost something, and reach agreements, and the idea of distributed ledgers. It was all brewing.
So when Satoshi Nakamoto showed up in 2008, it wasn't something completely brand new. It was more like putting all these existing ideas together in a really smart way.
That's it. Satoshi didn't invent everything from scratch. They took existing concepts and made them better. They combined Hashcash's proof of work, BitGold's public ledger, B-Money's peer-to-peer network for sending money, and then, the really big thing, they solved the double spending problem without needing a central authority. That was the thing that tripped up DigiCash.
And it's interesting that Bitcoin came out right during the 2008 financial crisis. It's like that crisis made people distrust banks and, maybe be more open to the idea of a decentralized alternative.
That's a great point. We can't know for sure what Satoshi was thinking, but yeah, the financial crisis definitely made people question the whole system, maybe made them more willing to consider radical new ideas about money.
So to sum it all up, Bitcoin didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was built on decades of research, people trying things out, and brilliant minds tackling the challenges of digital currency. Each of those early projects, from DigiCash to Hashcash, they all contributed something important.
I totally agree. And for you listening, knowing this history, it gives you a much deeper understanding of what makes Bitcoin truly innovative. It wasn't just some tech breakthrough, it was the result of years of thinking and problem solving, all happening within a specific culture and moment in time.
This deep dive into Bitcoin's origins has been really insightful. Seeing how those early systems struggled, it makes you wonder what the future holds for digital currencies. What new problems will we face? What crazy solutions will people come up with as this technology keeps evolving? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us.